Hello and welcome to day 2 of Fee's Entrepreneur Week. I am your host of this session, Sean Malone. I am Fee's creative director, and here with me today is just an absolutely incredible panel featuring my good friend Austin Wintory and video game legend Ken Levine. How are you guys doing today?
Great, Sean. Thanks for having us on.
I am so
Very
thrilled you
well.
guys are here. So I wanted to, before we actually get going, I've got a series of questions that I want to kind of start with, and then as Morgan said in the intro, there's going to be plenty of time for Q&A. Definitely get your questions in. I think there's a Q&A box on Zoom. You'll want to make sure you start getting your questions in early. We can talk about video games. We can talk about the creative industries in general. There's all kinds of stuff that we're going to be thrilled to talk about, but mostly, and of course, as the name implies, this event is about entrepreneurship. And so before I really get started with the panel here, what I wanted to do was take a second and kind of define what entrepreneurship is and what it's all about. So a little bit of groundwork. Entrepreneurship is, more than anything, it's a discovery process. It's a means of looking at the world and seeing what gaps exist, what problems need to be solved, and then the role of the entrepreneur essentially is to try to find ways to solve those problems. So that could be something as grand as solving a problem of, environmental degradation or, large scale, issues of food insecurity or things like that. But it could also be solving a very niche and very specific problem. For example, how to do better in a given industry that already sort of exists. So one of the things that I really wanted to get at just right up front was this idea of value creation and the nature of entrepreneurship as an act of trying to find ways of adding value to the world. And what I love about this is that it can be done, big, large scale, small scale, it doesn't matter. But what's important is that we're all trying to actually improve society in some kind of way. So with that said, creative careers are super interesting to me. Obviously, this is how I make my living and how all of our wonderful panelists do. But I'd like to start with, how do you guys see yourself in terms of value creation? What does that look like in terms of your direct clients? What does it look like in terms of their customers? What does it look like in terms of society at large? And I guess, we can really start into a conversation about this, but I think I'll kick it off with Ken.
I think that your notion of value creation is really important, and it sounds like boring and like dull, but it really is. No matter whether you're a plumber or a doctor or a video game developer, what you're doing is you have a client. And in our case, it's the gamer. And if you're making a game for a publisher, it's sort of both. It's the publisher first, they have to be happy with what you're doing, and then the gamer, and you have to create value for them. And that sounds dry, but what our value is the immersion and the fun and the ability to lose yourself in an experience. But there is a client there, right? There is a value creation. And I think that if you go into it thinking that I'm just here doing this for myself, and I can cover, it is important to do it for yourself because you're not doing something you love. If you're not making something that you think is cool, it's going to be very hard to create value for the gamer, for the customer.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, you are there. Without them, there is no game. There is no artwork. There is nothing. And so I'm very concerned, and I'm always thinking about the person I'm making this for at the end of I'm making this for. And if you forget that, I think you can lose your way. But if you keep that in mind, I think that informs a lot of your decisions, and it allows you to make something better because they're the fire. The gamer and the get initially it's the game testers. They're a fire that's going to harden the steel of what you're making. And if you shy away from that notion that you're creating something of value for people that they're going to find valuable, you're missing an opportunity to make better art. So it's not an either or proposition of business and art. It's about making something that is going to excite people and they're going to find valuable, because you're asking a lot of them. You're asking them to spend, $60 or $70, whatever, on your game. I respect that. I respect the fact that people are going to pay a really a fair amount of money for this thing, and not just their money, their time. You're asking to them to spend time on our little goofy game, and so I take that responsibility seriously.
Yeah, I think one of the kind of similarities in some ways when you mention time, of course, is for me, a lot of my work ends up on YouTube, and that's pretty much the entire currency, right? I mean, it's not necessarily that they're going to pay me for that experience, but if I can't maintain and hold their attention, there's literally a billion other things that they could be watching at the same time. So that time piece is so critical, and I think all of that just speaks to how are you adding value to their lives. Austin, you obviously you create music that sometimes is directly sold and listened to by a direct audience, but also you spend a lot of your time working for clients specifically and creating products in service of somebody else's vision. So how do you approach value creation when it's not necessarily directly your final vision that's going to be on screen or in the game or whatever?
It's remarkably complicated because at the end of the day, if I'm writing music for a game, the end user of the player is still in a way the kind of highest level customer that I have, even though I have this crucial intermediary in the form of the game director or the producers who are going to influence where we go and are going to be sort of the arbiter of taste on many things. And but it's a collaboration, and it's interesting because they're like someone in Ken's position is trying to make the game all that it can be for the player, and so am I. And the hope is that kind of through these variety of perspectives, we're sort of triangulating on what that hopefully is. And pushing each other and pulling each other. And but yeah, there's no question that sometimes when you reach a kind of an impasse or a crossroad where it's like, well, we're not really seeing eye to eye, I have to evaluate, well, who am I ultimately answering to? Like, if I was hired by this person, then that notion of value creation is ultimately about creating value for them and then just hoping that it translates to broad value creation for the game. And sometimes that works and sometimes not. And that's part of the inherent challenge of someone in Ken's position, is just trusting that, like, as all the spider web threads kind of funnel their way into one nexus, that it's actually all coming off as planned, because you have all these different egos and all these different life experiences and creative instincts and all that are kind of trying to jostle into position together. And so it's interesting because, it's one of those where I often will say to a director, my loyalty is not really to you, it's to the game. Like, I will challenge you if I think we're doing disservice to the game. And I can say that without hesitation, because a good director would hope that is the case. They're hoping that I can be there to kind of say, all right, well, this is a really cool idea, but it's sort of applicable to a different game than the one we're making. That's the best case scenario of a negative moment like that. The worst ones would be like, this is just not a good idea. It's not going to serve this or any other game. But it's amazingly difficult to see these things when you're on the inside. Sorry, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, I think what it gets to, what it speaks to a little bit is what I was trying to get at with the kind of preamble was that there are kind of layers of the way that you can think about entrepreneurship. I think a lot of people tend to think about it as somebody who is a business owner or the leader of a company or somebody who created a company from scratch or whatever. But even within a role inside a company or inside a project, because that's a lot of times what one of the big differences I think between creative careers and a lot of other kinds of careers is quite often, rather than working for a single company, you end up working for many companies as basically a composer for hire or a developer for hire or whatever. And so, but even still, even if you're not the owner of the company, even if it's not a sole proprietorship, or you're, thinking about the way that entrepreneurs are usually presented in on TV and in film and stuff, you're thinking in the same way. You're thinking about how you can find and exploit a gap that exists and solve a problem that maybe sometimes you're the only one who can see. And that's kind of what Austin, your point is, like, if there are cases even when working with game directors or developers where you see a problem that maybe they don't even see. And I think finding those kinds of problems is sort of the essence of all of it. It's also what, for me, makes it really, really creative as a concept, not just, I think, again, it can be, like what Ken said, value creation can sound very stale or boring or whatever, but it is actually a very creative activity to try to think about, what are people going to like? What are people struggling with as gamers, as players, Ken, how do you think about that? Like, when you're thinking about creating a new game or working on an expansion of a game or something like that, like, what gets you into that mindset of the player that helps you get past, like, what are their problems? What am I going to solve for them?
Yeah, it's a lot trickier, like making artistic endeavors and sort of like trying to make, a new widget to open, a new can opener, because you perceive that, nobody's made, there's this problem I have in the kitchen, and if only I had this device, then my life would be a lot easier. The thing, that wraps your food in airtight, airtight plastic or something. There was an inventor who saw a real problem, but nobody's got a problem, which is like, I don't have this game. Like
a lack of Bioshock in my life.
Yeah. Before we made Bioshock, nobody was like, "Oh man, I wish somebody would make Bioshock." And so you don't really know, but what you do look for is, that people like to be entertained, and that people like new experiences, but they're also nervous about new experiences too. There's when I was a screenwriter, there's a great book, if you ever want to be a screenwriter, called Adventures in the Screen Tray by William Goldman. And what he wrote, like a ton of screenplays in the 70s, very well known. And he has this great line, which he says that what Hollywood wants is the same but different. And what he means, and that's why you hear so many times the pitch of something meets something, it's Indiana Jones meets Mad Men or whatever, because it gives people an understanding of what sort of they're getting, but there's a new element they haven't seen before. So when we were, making Bioshock, I had a feeling that that people wanted I wanted, and that's where I started. I like shooters, but I thought the worlds were sterile. Some of the worlds tended to be sterile and lacking of character, and I felt like I was sort of in these pre-constructed arenas for shooting, but there was no storytelling going on. And I knew gamers like storytelling. I knew they like shooters. And I was like, well, is there a way to, to combine these elements to make something new? And I'm not even sure I was sort of consciously thinking that, but I think that was probably the value proposition of that game, right? For the audience. It's the thing they didn't have enough of. And so when we started down the road, I think that was more subconscious and conscious, because I don't know if you can, like, as our artists, really know for sure if that thing is, but in looking back at it, I think that was probably, what made it successful. But moving on into the future, as the stuff we're working on, when we do a next game or the game we're working on now, I'm always looking for what sort of, as a gamer, what am I missing as a gamer? There is no kitchen utensil I'm missing, but as a gamer, what am I not playing that I think would be cool? And so I'm always focused on myself in some way as a proxy gamer, because if I try to make a game like I don't play a lot of multiplayer competitive shooters, so I wouldn't have a really good sense of what's missing in that field. But I play a lot of single player, narrative experiences, and I know what's there. I know what isn't there. And so I try to find some way where we can be different and stand out and innovate. But that has to be something that I guess I'm the first client in that sense, right?
Yeah.
Is would I like this? But then working in a creative space, man, one thing you're really fortunate about, like when you work at a toilet bowl company or something. Well, everybody probably uses toilets in the toilet bowl company, but you don't really have, maybe people aren't super passionate about toilets. But at a game company, usually most people there are your frontline, can be proxies for consumers. So not only are they valuable colleagues, but they're going to be there to tell you, if you don't listen to them at all, like if you just ignore them, like Austin was saying, like if your music guy comes up to you and says, I don't know, dude, this is pretty dumb, or it's not really working, or I don't think this fits, or I don't think this adds value, you can ignore them, or you can or say every time somebody says that to you, you can say, sure, you're right, that's what we're going to do. The tricky part about being a creative director is to know how to take those concerns seriously, but also try to know when maybe they're not seeing the thing you're seeing that maybe just needs a little more time in the oven. And you're right as often as you're wrong, and maybe you're wrong a little more often than you're right. But you have to be open to being wrong.
How
if
hard
you're
is that line to walk too? Like it's so slippery.
Yeah.
How many I've watched Shark Tank so many times where somebody comes in and goes, "It must be this way," and they go, "Well, I'm out because you seem totally inflexible and like receptive to good feedback from people that know what they're talking about." And then the opposite happens where someone comes in and they go, "What do you guys think? Tell me what I need." And they're like, well, I'm out because you have no vision and no sense of ability to
Yeah.
lead. And it's like, those are seemingly, you can't be out for both of those things seemingly. And yet it makes sense, especially when you've been in that chair, you have to sort of lead and listen. And like you said, be willing to be wrong. A lot of what I do is the microcosm of these larger things that Ken is grappling with in a more broad leadership position.
What's amusing to me, Austin, is that's sort of like I have questions loosely that I wanted to talk about, and that was more or less the fourth one on my list, actually, which is that like being a great entrepreneur sort of requires you to balance accepting feedback and really listening to people and thinking about those kinds of things with having a vision that you're confident about and that you're actually willing to go to bat for. And I think and I think that's true of entrepreneurship in general, but I think it's doubly true for creative endeavors, because if you can't go to bat for your own ideas, and if you don't have confidence in your own ideas, literally nobody else is going to, because as Ken said, there's nobody out there who's just sitting around going like, oh, I need a Bioshock. Well, if you see a Bioshock, if you see that if you have the vision for that and you give up on it too early, then it will never be anything. But also, if you believe in it so much that anytime anybody says anything to you, you just go, I don't care what you think.
I think there's a question I get a lot, which I think is illustrative of some of the challenges and problems of this, and I think Austin probably has experienced this as well. I get asked a lot, like, "Oh, what changed from your original vision for whatever?"
Yeah.
And the truth is, the original vision is kind of meaningless. Like there is no, writing is rewriting, and that's the truest thing in any media. And you can say that about painting, or it is, the game is done when we run out of mistakes, and it's a process of making mistakes. Like any work of art or anything is really basically failing and being comfortable and failing and failing and failing and being comfortable with, because you're never going to get it right at the beginning. There is no game I've ever conceived in my head and then was like, let's just transfer this to pixels. It doesn't work that way. When Austin, I know what your take is, but I assume you're not like sit down at the piano and like write something and you're like, well, that's done. It's
basically
they say
never
view
the
on
case.
failure. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, every now and again, I'll sit down and kind of vomit out a piece, and then it's like, that's not bad, and I end up barely changing it. But I always consider that moments of it's like grace touching me, because it's overwhelmingly the exception. And I think it only ever happens because the creative instincts are obviously honed from a billion hours of failure and iteration and learning from other times, such that I am armed to 1 out of 1,000 get it right out of the gate, by virtue of those past failures. So it's not even like parallel tracks where sometimes I get it right and most of the time I get it wrong. It's like sometimes I get it right because of all those other times I got it wrong.
Well, but also, Austin, I mean, there are times, I mean, speaking, from my background as a composer, I can say too, there are plenty of times where I've written something that I've been like, oh, I love this. This is amazing. And I'm super happy with this. And, it didn't take a whole lot of rewrites or revisions or whatever, but then you play it for the client and the client's like, it's okay. So, I mean, it's not just you involved in this.
That's the norm.
Right. So it's like, even if you're happy with it, doesn't necessarily mean that the client's going to be happy with it, or that the customer, either the audience, is ultimately going to be happy with it. So
I've even had situations before where, I was working in a kind of communal project where everybody's invited to weigh in, and there's no like strictly enforced hierarchy of, don't speak until spoken to kind of thing, which in general is a better way to work. Like, the more communal approach is generally a better way to work, at least in games, where everybody can throw in, because a great idea can come from unexpected corners. And like Ken said, most everybody is really passionate about how do we make the game better, and they get excited. And I like when people, the animator is saying, hey, I liked that thing you did with the music here. What do you think of this or that? And, or I got a person programming physics sending me a YouTube video of, have you ever heard of this instrument? That could be a cool thing to put in the score or whatever. And so I really like the sort of shared team approach. But I have seen it before where, the creative director listens to something and goes, this is magnificent. I love it. It's great. And then an intern goes, I don't know, it kind of made me feel like this. And then that sort of starts to spread, and everybody's like, actually, yeah, I guess it does maybe. Then before I know it, I'm getting feedback. 5 seconds earlier, I was in the end zone and told this is good. And then some random person kind of bled out this thing. But I'm of the mind, it's a very kind of Darwinist attitude where I want those ideas that survive to truly be the fittest, and not to be the ones that were kind of given some privileged position, or that were muscled there into no, just trust me, it's this way. Or, my contract says you only get so many rewrites, and I've done, you ready to pay me more? I'm like, I just want the best idea to be the one that makes it to the end.
There's this term I hear thrown around a lot, which is imposter syndrome. And I think it really misunderstands what it is to be an effective creative. Is that if you don't have, I don't know what the opposite of imposter syndrome is, like this sort of I'm always right syndrome. We're all imposters at times, right? Because we're always making mistakes, right? We're very rarely not an imposter, because we very rarely have days at work where everything we do is right. We're constantly making mistakes. And so I think people think that there's some kind of confidence that you get with success. I think there's some, but that confidence can be poison too, right? That
Oh, for sure.
So I think you need a confidence in a process, and I think that's something I developed over time, is a confidence that if you do the thing with enough time with good people, you will come up with something good if you trust a process. But trusting yourself and going in and saying, well, I know what I'm doing, I'm the creative director, I'm Ken Levine, and I've done this, is really a recipe for disaster. So there's this weird mix of confidence and terror that I think is really important, because if you're not scared, you're probably should be, because you're doing something that's, hard to do, doing creative work. Most creative work fails. Yeah. Most creative work doesn't find an audience. And I'm always really, really aware of that I haven't, just because I've had a couple of successes doesn't mean I'm anointed by the gods to be successful. Each time you go to bat, you have to prove you're not an imposter. And the first person you have to prove it is to yourself. And so that's never going to go away. There's never going to be a day you wake up and you're like, I'm not an imposter. So it's something to embrace, and it can be a useful tool. And And there's always going to be, and I'm grateful for this, that there's always people around me who are going to tell me that's wrong. And they're not always right, right? But they're not always wrong. And that's really important. And when you're done, when the whole thing is done and it goes out, eventually the audience will tell you, like, the audience will give you your scorecard. And
Yeah.
and that will come, and you have to be humbled by that, but you also have to be able to live with the discomfort of the fact that you don't know the answers, and there is no right answer.
Yeah.
Ever.
You bring up something there that we had a conversation the other day where something that you said stuck out to me, Ken, which was, the big difference in being in a hits based industry versus what we kind of called a rent seeking kind of industry. And to give people a little context to that, like, there are a lot of industries that sort of exist by continually churning out another iteration of the same thing, but everybody's going to need it. I mean, again, you mentioned toilet poles, and this is actually a pretty good example of that kind of thing. Like, everybody's going to need a porcelain toilet or some form of that kind of thing. Like, they're always going to need that. And so you can find a lot of security and sort of economic strength as an individual by going into one of those kinds of industries and really delivering on something that is going to be repeatedly valued by a large number of people. And everybody's going to want that. But an artistic career is very different because you don't need necessarily this game or that game. People want games, obviously. People want music. People want videos made. Everybody wants that kind of stuff. But they don't necessarily need your game. They don't necessarily need your movie or your
Chances are,
record.
overwhelmingly, they don't need your
Well, and yeah, I mean, and the market, I mean, looking at the market itself, I mean, you can very, very clearly see that the overwhelming majority are failures in that regard, right? People don't actually decide that they want your album or your game or whatever. And so it's very competitive. But that's what makes thriving in such an industry so hard. But what we were talking about the other day was I mean, and actually we're talking about this in the in the context of a sort of a conversation about work-life balance and what that means, which I think we can get into here in a second. But I think what's interesting is, like, when you're in a hits-based sort of field, like, you can't really afford to rest that much. You can't afford to just say, well, my last thing was a hit, so obviously I've won and I know exactly what I'm doing, and everything else I produce here on into the future will be a hit. And so I think, I don't know, Austin and Ken both, I'd love to maybe explore a little bit more of this idea of humility, because I think that, confidence is critical. I don't think any of us would disagree that, like, you actually do have to have some level of confidence to do this kind of work, but you also have to be aware that, every time you go up for bat, it can go wrong every time. So I don't know, Austin, since I'd love to hear your perspective, and then Ken, maybe your perspective to dive into this a little bit more as well.
Well, I saw a quote making the rounds recently that was something along the lines of, I think you might have shared this, and I saw a few others as well, that, the entrepreneur works 90 hours a week to avoid working 40 hours a week, something to that effect, which definitely speaks to me. And I also think that notion of you can't afford to sort of, the way I would put that is you can't afford to sort of leave anything off the table every time at bat. That's the thing, because when you're making a product that's different from, like, if I'm working in the toilet bowl company and my job is, making sure that the people delivering the metal armature that lifts the plunger thing in the tank in the back, if those all fit our porcelain, bowls, like, if my job is to oversee the process to make sure that parts coming in match the parts that we're making, and, like, I screw up and 100 toilets have to get trashed, I come back on Monday and I'm like, well, unless this is a pattern repeatedly, and management's looking at me going, not sure you're the right person for this job. I have a chance to basically make amends on Monday, and my life is relatively stable. And in exchange, if I want to do Saturdays and Sundays that have nothing to do with toilet bowls, or if I want, at 5 o'clock Monday through Friday to do something totally different with my life, and the trade-off is that stability, and that's a perfectly fair trade. And my line of work, especially as a freelancer, where I remember once I had the composer came and spoke at NYU while I was there, who said the best part about my job is that every day I wake up fired. And that really has stuck with me for almost 20 years now, because I thought 90% of the people in the audience took that the wrong way. And I think because everyone was like, oh, well, that sounds miserable. And I saw it as it just means every day is this new, I'm going into battle fresh every day. And winning is the only thing that you can do in a battle if you want to come out of it. I can't just rely on, oh, well, I screwed up, but Monday it'll be fine. I saw a stat the other day. I haven't vetted this. I don't know if this is true, but it certainly is believable, that something like 10,000 new games are released just on Steam, the platform for primarily PC gaming, every year, which comes out to something like a little bit more than one game per hour, 365 days a year. And it's
that's insane.
If you think, oh, I don't really need to focus too hard on this one because I'm sure there will be other opportunities. It's by the time you finish that sentence, 10 more games have come out that are giving everything they've got to that scenario. And it's
yeah.
And to me, I find that thrilling, even though it's daunting. It is thrilling. And I think that, but yes, to your question specifically about work-life balance, that remains one of the biggest challenges to me. That it's almost a misnomer, because it's work and life are synonymous, and it's a question of subdivision of life into one of 50 categories, 47 of which are basically still work, but they're shades of how far, or I'll have a lunch meeting, for example, and my girlfriend Angela will say oh, is this about a project? And I'm like, oh, no. Oh, so it's just a casual hang. Well, no, not exactly that either. This is somebody that I work with periodically, and I just like to maintain my relationship with, and I enjoy hanging out with them. Well, so was it casual or was it work? And it's I don't know how to answer this question that's going to be fully satisfying, because most things in my life are some blur of the two. Let
me tee Ken up a little bit, because there was another thing.
Can I just comment on one thing I was going to say? All right. A lot of times, there's this thing people are oh, let's not talk shop, and I'm like, well, what else are we going to talk about? Because I love shop, I love what I do, and I think that's so. In terms of work-life balance.
Also, in your case, shop. I'm just going to interrupt you, because also what I love is that, particularly in your case with the kind of games that you make, talking shop is basically all subjects under the sun of the human experience can qualify as talking shop in your particular case, especially grand questions of philosophy and how to be a good person and how to construct the best and most sort of reasonable societies, all that kind of thing. That is actually a form of talking shop.
I produce now it's a bi-monthly YouTube series called Out of Frame, which is in the thing below here. But where I talk about movies and TV shows, and I talk about the ideas, philosophy, economics, stuff in those kinds of shows. And this comes back to a couple things that we've talked about over the course of this discussion so far, which is that, first of all, I wouldn't be able to do that if I didn't actually have a lot of passion for that kind of stuff. If I didn't care about the movies, if I didn't care about the ideas that I was talking about, if it was all just me writing something for the sake of sort of shilling my way through some, kind of crass or cynical, treatment of these things, it wouldn't come across very well. Nobody would believe that I actually enjoyed the movie that I was talking about, or that I actually had something to say about these ideas. So
especially in those domains.
Oh,
You know,
yeah.
like
I mean,
comic nerds would see right
yeah.
through you.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and by the way, one of the reasons why, I mean, and this is my sort of mea culpa for this panel in specific, I'm not a big gamer. And so people have asked me repeatedly to do episodes of the series on video games. They'll be like, oh, you got to do, you know, the Bioshock. Even that's come up a bunch, but I've gotten, you know, The Witcher, or I've gotten, you know, there's tons and tons of games, Overwatch or whatever, you know, do a breakdown of Overwatch. And I'll go, well, I haven't played Overwatch. So like, I don't know, like if,
Right.
and I know for a fact that if I went out there and I tried to make a video on Overwatch, I'd get destroyed in the comments, because everybody would go, oh, you missed this, you missed this, you missed this, you didn't care about that. You're right. I would have missed all of it. But I think part of that goes back to like the blurring of those lines for me, because what I'm doing in the series is what I do with my friends. There's no distinction. Like, it's just, I love this stuff, so I talk about it, and I found a way to merge the things that I like with the things that I do well enough to like actually create value for a broader range of people, and then I get paid for it. I mean, that's kind of, and for me, that's kind of the goal, right? Like that's kind of the magic of having these kinds of careers, potentially.
You know, to go back to what we were saying the other day, is I think there's like, you know, in terms of people balancing their lives, I think there's different ways to live your life. There are some people like Austin and I who work is such a central part of our life, and it's so definitional of what we are, that sometimes, you know, we struggle to have variety in our lives that aren't work. And I have a very patient wife, you know, Meredith, and Austin's got a very patient
Same.
girlfriend.
Same.
But making sure you're watering all the plants in your life is important. You know, that they all get water, but I think you should know who you are. And when you go into a creative field, and there's, like you said, you know, we're talking about, you know, essentially rent-seeking organizations like Facebook and Twitter, which have a business model that's so successful that nobody there really needs to work that hard, because the product doesn't really need to improve, and they're collecting so much money that they can afford to just have this giant umbrella of people working there. And I think that those are really good places to work if you want balance, you know, if you want a lot of balance. And I think the more creative, because there is no, like, there are no sort of like, there's never been a monopoly, you know, there's never been a games monopoly. Oh, there's the game Monopoly, but there's never been a game that had monopolistic hold on the universe. You have some shooters like, you know, like Call of Duty or something that are very successful, or GTA, which are the closest things to it. But there's still a huge broad space of games, you know, and I've never made one of those games that is just, you know, that, you know, I want it, that I can go franchise forever.
But do you even think that Call of Duty can't be toppled by some? I mean, I don't think for a second that there isn't somebody who can overtake that culturally in a heartbeat.
I mean, you have, let me get in the camera, you know, you have Coke, right, which has been around for, I don't know, like over 100 years, and they have such dominance at the marketplace that they can effectively, you know, use their financial dominance to buy marketing, to buy end caps at the supermarket, to dominate. Because, you know, when you go in the supermarket and you see those big things at the end of the aisles, that's where the supermarket makes their money, because Coke is paying $1 zillion to buy those end caps, so you make sure everybody sees the Coke, where some new guy is going to be this tiny little, you know, bottom shelf, you know, with no advertising, no marketing whatsoever. And they're going to have to try to get by on their, you know, the uniqueness of their product, and identifying an unsatisfied niche or a quality level that other people aren't hitting. Where games, there is no Coke in games, you know, there is no Facebook in games. So I think that the most important thing you can do deciding, you know, what kind of career you want, is making sure that you are going to a place that is going to serve the needs of what you want, you know, for your life, because you are catering for your life. Like Austin says, games are tough because there's you said 10,000 games a year coming out, and if you're not cracking, if you're not cracking the code,
Yeah.
with each game, then it's years to have another bite at the apple. Years. The last game I shipped was 2000. Well, the DLC was 2014. So I've been working on this thing for a very long time. And if I don't crack the code, that's a significant chunk of my life, which is dedicated to something that, in the end of the day, didn't work out. Unlike working at the toilet factory, where you have a more steady. The problems aren't. It's not a hits-based industry as much. I'm sure people in the toilet industry may write to me and say, "No, dude, you don't understand the toilet industry." So I might be wrong, but the margin for error is greater because you have a continuous production of products, not this once every X years you deliver something.
So, guys, it is. We have 45 minutes left, technically, and I have 30 questions lined up.
Wow.
Let's do questions then.
Sorry, 31 at this point. They're just flying in here.
Great.
So I love that, and that's very, very exciting. Now, a lot of them are about Bioshock and things like that, and so I think maybe we can hit a couple of those, but I don't know that I want to focus necessarily a ton
Hell,
on
I
that.
have questions about Bioshock, so that's
Well, one of them was what's behind the tiny door. So that was one of the first questions.
I'll never tell. Well, I get that question all the time, and I'm never going to tell.
We've got all
tell,
kinds.
but you don't want to know.
But
got Frodo as a kidnap victim.
There are a lot. So what I'd like to do, since we have so many, I'd like to try to be relatively succinct with answers, and then if we feel like we want to explore something like more deeply, then I think we can go into it. But I'm going to kind of go my way down the list. I'm not going to get to everything for sure, but I'll say this. All right, so this is the first one, and I think this is a really good one. I'm going to creative arts college, and I have had doubts about whether or not I'll be able to make a living doing what I want to do. How do you keep yourself confident and driven while chasing making a living at a creative profession?
Well, I can just throw in my 2 cents that I don't know that there is any solution to having the confidence, because the confidence really only stems from any kind of positive feedback that you're doing it. So you can't really have the confidence of like, I know this is going to work out, before you have any semblance of it working out. And like I've done pretty well the last 10 years, but there's nothing to suggest that the next 10 years will at all resemble the past 10 years. So even the confidence that I've been able to build, like Ken was just talking about with, his new game, it could all theoretically be a total disaster despite the massive train of accolades that preceded it. So I think that in a way it's confidence is almost not the thing you need. It's almost like stubbornness and a genuine passion.
Yeah.
Like I remember once, I promise I'll be succinct. Did you ever study with Denise Hughes? I think you did.
Yeah, I did.
One of our shared teacher, who I had many arguments with, but one thing she said that was truly brilliant, that I never forgot about, was she said, to be a composer, you must have at least these 5 attributes. Your music is the no-brainer. Like you can't be a slouch of a composer, but you also really need to understand the business and the legal structure of these industries to know, like when you're negotiating with someone, empathize with their side of the table, understand that when someone's trying to put a dollar value on what your contribution is going to be, what is driving their calculation of that, and how do you interact in that way. The technological side of it, which is especially true in video games.
Yeah.
There's a certain hard to pin down personality type, which was the 4th one. She was like, you have to be comfortable interacting with people. And it's, there are the occasional hardcore reclusive types that make it as composers, but as a freelancer, you pretty much have to be a people person. It's really challenging there. And there are people that have done it. So none of these are ironclad. There's also lackluster composers that have done it. So they're all truly, not ironclad. But the 5th one, the one that struck me the most, is she said, you have to have a kind of irrational passion for it. Like she said, you would get a volunteer unpaid internship position to mop the floors at a recording studio if you thought through the glass I might see John Williams recording a score one day, like as the janitor who's not actually welcome. She's like, if that proximity to it, if that passion drives you, anything less than that, it's probably going to kick your ass, and it will. The hard days might get the better of you, and that's just, I think, it's not necessarily an ideal fact of life, but I do think it's a fact of life.
I want to address the. Sorry.
No, please.
Sorry, did I cut you off, Austin? I want to address the notion of college and creativity.
Yeah.
So I went to college and I was a drama major at college, and I learned almost nothing. I mean, I learned some things being in the actual classes and work, but where it was valuable I put on outside of my class structure, we could get a very tiny amount of funding to put on these plays. And I learned how to market those things, write them. I wrote them, I directed them in most cases. I advertised for them. I made sure the money worked. I got the venue. That stuff, the entrepreneur stuff I learned there was way more important. So I would say, if I could go back and do it again, I'm not even sure I would go to college. Because especially now with YouTube, the amount of things you can learn, the amount of autodidactism I've done as an adult versus what I learned in school it doesn't even compare. I didn't leave school particularly well educated. I wasn't really paying attention. I was more focused on putting on my plays and, chasing girls, than I was in my studies. And maybe it's on me, but I'm not even sure that like creative college is a good idea in general. And I'll probably get a lot of people hate for this, but if you could spend that time finding like-minded people, and now you can do that, with the internet, you can find making mods, making small projects, learning how to ship something, learning how to please an audience, learning how to react to an audience, learning how to organize people, how to work with people, how to organize, how to make something. It's something that you can only really do by doing. So I think it's hard to be taught that in a classroom, but find any opportunity you can to actually do stuff, especially where you don't have like some teacher to come in and save you, because once you get out, there's never going to be anybody to come in and save you.
Yeah. To combine both of those pieces of advice, honestly, I want to say like that confidence will only, to Austin's point, if you do by doing, that confidence will eventually come because you'll have had successes, right? And I think if you have smaller successes along the way, like putting on your sort of community plays, like that gives you a little bit of that, say, okay, yeah, absolutely. I can do this. I can do something bigger. I can do something more.
Yeah, when I got a laugh from one of my plays in an audience and I had written it and I had directed it and I had raised the money and I had done those things, and you hear the audience respond, that was more important to me than any comment or grade I ever got from some teacher.
So this actually, I feel like this was the very first question that came in, and I think it actually sort of combines. We'll try to keep it short, but like I think it's an interesting one, which is really just for Ken. But what's the process for you of laying out the narrative or the story progression for Bioshock? But like, they say Bioshock Infinite in this case, but like I would say, what's your process for laying out the story arc of a game in general?
I mean, unfortunately, the process is there is no process. I mean, I have some things I usually do, like I leverage a 3-act structure, which I got from writing movies. And if you don't know what a 3-act structure is, there's a book by Sid Field called Screenplay, which will very quickly teach you that.
It's a great book.
Better than any college course is going to do. Mm-hmm. You can look up Dan Harmon's guy who did Rick and Morty and Community. He has a thing called a story circle, which are very useful, just structural tools, and they're tools you want to learn and then kind of forget about. But they give you, like music theory will give you a basic structural understanding of how to do things. But generally, I try to think of, a story that I can get across in a sentence. Bioshock, it's a Robinson Crusoe story where you crash in this crazy world and you have to find your way out. Infinite was a detective story. You have to go find this girl and rescue her from this city, and then you just go get weirder and weirder from there. But starting with something very simple and gettable. So you like if you ask somebody what your story is, you can say it and it's gettable and it's going to sound probably like a lot of other stories because most story there's only so many stories out there. But be grounded and then work from there and then get weird from there. But start with a grounding.
So this feels like a sort of an offshoot kind of question to me, but this is for both of you guys, and it's a little bit long, so I'm not gonna like read through the whole thing, but I'm gonna say like, what are your thoughts on trying to break the mold in an industry? And the context of this is somebody who is a tabletop RPG dev and trying to get away from the sort of tropes of D&D inside that realm. And so, and again, I don't know how weird they want to get with this, right? But I guess the question is, how do you, and this goes back to what you'd said about, sort of the same thing but different and that kind of thing. How different can you go, and how do you get people on board with doing something different when all they're kind of, used to is something very similar to what they've seen before?
I definitely have thoughts on this, and I think that everything is iterative, and like in a way, like what Ken just said, detective story. Now, like one small step at a time, let's kind of make it more interesting than just this very generic top level detective has to go rescue a girl from a city. Okay, well, what if it's a floating city? Oh, okay, well, what if the girl has sort of like supernatural powers, or, like it starts to slowly iterate off of that thing. And the thing that's always hard to tell from the outside, especially as the consumer, is what the process was. All you're getting is the finished product. And so that whole breaking the mold thing, it often is imagining the end of the road as if it's this thing you're going to divine. And like, oh, I've just created this perfect, amazing, like D&D eschewing tabletop RPG. But it's like the player 5 years from now might be playing that and be blown away at this thing. But they won't necessarily know about the seemingly mandatory 1,000 versions between D&D out of the box today and your super unique version 5 years from now that it took to get there, all those little steps. So I mean, I deal with this all the time because I get hired and they say, I think every project brief I have ever done starts with, okay, we really want it to be fresh and bold and like something no one's ever heard, and here's the list of very mainstream references that we love. And so it's like, okay, how do I respect the fact that you love The Dark Knight and you love Inception and all that, but like inch us away, and it's never an overnight process, and that's just, I think, just a fact of life.
I think one thing Austin brings a really good point. We love these. The things our references are these movies that everybody has seen is a problem because, like with Bioshock, most gamers hadn't read The Fountainhead, and most gamers didn't know anything about Art Deco, and most gamers didn't know who Johnny Mathis was, and so I found things that I have a fairly eclectic, weird taste in a bunch of things, and like even for the music, it was a lot. I talked to my father a lot about music, the popular music from the 50s that he grew up with, and I grew to get a love of those things. So I grew up with them playing those things on the 8-track tape player in the car. So that's what made me weird, and that's what made me different. And if your tastes are all completely mainstream, it's trickier because there's hard to bring freshness into the experience. Now, if your tastes are really eclectic and you're like, well, I really love Friedrich Nietzsche, and I'm gonna write this thing, and you better understand Nietzsche. You better have read these 40 works by him before you understand. Then you're going to screw it up because you're not building a bridge. I worked with a musical style, and I have a member of the team who hated the musical style going in, and I'm like, I only know this musical style is going to work when this guy likes it in the game. this guy who's predisposed to not like it, because that means I'm building a bridge because it's something I love, but it's weird and strange,
Yeah.
and it's not common and it's not mainstream. But I can't just play that for somebody and say, like, isn't it great? Isn't it awesome?
Yeah.
You have to find the bridge, and that's your job as an artist, to build the bridge. But if you just love mainstream of something, you better find something weird and different in what you love, and you can try to bring that as a new spice and a new flavor.
That bridge idea, I think, is probably the most critical aspect to answering that. Like, if you want to like really intentionally do something super weird, like, you've got to recognize that probably most of your audience they're not gonna be there with you, right? So if you can find a way to bring them with you, I think you might. And then again, obviously, it's not just the audience, but it's also your financiers and people who are going to pay for it, and people who are going to help you develop it and work with you. And
you're always selling. You're selling to the financiers. You're selling to your team, and that's important. Like, you're selling to the gamer. Like, no matter what you're doing, everything you do, and that's why, like, when people on the team pitch things to me, I ask them the same questions I ask myself. It's like, well, what's it in a sentence? And if they can't sell it to me, then I know it's going to be hard for me to sell it to an audience. And so we are salesmen. We're salesmen of fun and ideas. I know that sounds really reductive, but I promise you, if you think about it that way, if you think about that, I have to get this idea across to that person I'm in the room with first. And if you don't think about it that way, you're missing an opportunity to refine your craft. And that doesn't mean that person's always going to be right.
Also, like, what we're selling is not food or toothpaste or something. The only way that people buy it is if they get something out of it. Like, the idea of rejecting the notion that we're always selling is so bizarre, because the only way someone buys it is if they like it, if it adds meaning to their life, it makes them feel things they want to feel, or think things that take their mind in new places. Like, what an amazing feat to be able to offer that to somebody. I think it's an incredible experience.
Yeah, it is a really conscious choice. Like, you don't just walk down the aisles of the grocery store and go, I need toothpaste, I'll grab that one, who cares, which a lot of times people do. You have to go, if you're going to GameStop, if you're going to Amazon or whatever, Steam or wherever, like, you're choosing this. Like, I want this. This speaks to me in some kind of way, which is pretty different. Let me go to another question here. There's a lot of we're up to like 45 now, so I'm trying to go through these. But this is an interesting one, I think. Oh man, we may end up at a lightning round here at some point. But this is an interesting one to me, because I think there's a whole bunch of questions in here about how you break into the game industry and how you break into a creative career. So I'd love to hear some general thoughts on that. But this specifically kind of speaks to me because it's thoughts on making creative elevator pitches without being pushy or being a doormat and still trying to infuse the elevator pitch with passion or emotion. So I think for me, like, it connects to the breaking in side of things, because even in a sense, even if you're just trying to get a job, you are making an elevator pitch for yourself in some ways. Yeah. So I'd be curious to hear your guys' thoughts on breaking in and how you walk that line of, like, not being like an arrogant little brat who's coming in saying you know everything, but also showing that you can actually add value to the company or to the industry in general.
I'll say mine very quickly, because I know we're trying to get through a lot of questions. I have something called I wrote a piece called Getting In, and if you go to my Twitter page, there'll be a link to it. It's a Medium piece I wrote about getting into the games industry, and most of my thoughts are there better than I can describe them in a quick format here. So I'll turn it over to Austin.
Yeah, I think it's funny because I don't even know that I have a good elevator pitch for myself. The thing that I consistently explain to people that are considering hiring me is that I don't consider what I sell to be the finished product, but the process by which we get there. The primary transaction is in the collaboration. I want them to, first off, enjoy it. And I want that also to feel like it's a thing where they're being heard and they're also being challenged and I'm being challenged, and that we get somewhere in the end where we all look at it and go, wow, this is better than what we had hoped we would achieve. And I am just as indebted to them for their feedback and their guidance as they are to me for actually being the author of it. Like I said, the closest thing I typically have to an elevator pitch is, if that sounds appealing, then I'm your guy. Because sometimes it's not. Sometimes they're like, we really just want a kind of turnkey solution. We're not really looking to like explore our feelings with this music. We just need something that feels very heroic and comes in at 42 seconds when the character turns to the frame. And I go, cool. Like, if you still want to work with me, I can probably find a way to do that for you. Sure. But like, I'm going to try. I can't resist trying to kick over rocks to make it better than like the standard, or at least different from the standard. And if you really just genuinely want it to be like this drag and drop thing, like, there are probably lower friction ways for you to get that, and you have every right to pursue that to your, I'm not here to tell you how to make your game. So it's not, this is contingent on it being a ride to the top of the observation deck in the Empire State Building for it to work as my elevator pitch. But, one sentence part I'm not so good at.
I think at the beginning though, there is, just remember that you are there to, people are looking, when people come into a room to pitch to somebody, the person in the room that you're pitching to has a problem and they need it solved. Solve their problem.
Yep.
That's the most basic thing I can say, because at the end of the day, they just met you, they don't know you, they don't care. They have a problem to solve. That's why you're in the room. And if you can help figure out what their problem is and solve that problem, especially when you're getting started.
My agent's kind of one-liner on that specific frame of thinking is, for composers particularly, but I think this would broadly apply to people that are trying to find their way into an industry where they don't know anybody yet or whatnot. Her advice, which I like, is be the solution to the problem that someone doesn't even know they have yet. Like, if you can just walk in the door and provide a solution that exposes the problem in that same moment, you've really pulled off the ultimate coup.
Austin, this is a perfect example of why this discussion, for us anyway, why it's happening with an Entrepreneur Week kind of session. I mean, this is exactly what that is about, right? Entrepreneurship is about finding a solution to a problem that people don't really even necessarily know that they have. Seeing those gaps is critical.
I'm not sure I'd 100% agree with that agent advice, because I think that I know when I have somebody come in, there is a problem. If they can solve something else, or they can solve a problem I don't know I have, but if they can't solve the problem I know I have, then
fair.
That's tricky. So it does take you're a really experienced, smart guy, Austin, and I think that is an advanced level Jedi mind trick one can learn over time, and that's what makes you truly special. I think that when you're just getting started, I don't want to overwhelm people with like that is an super advanced technique, and a guy like you can, I think, figure that out. I wonder though, when I was 21 or something, if I'd be able to pull that off.
Well, I can give you a practical example of when I was at USC. I think things all operate differently now, but when I was at USC, I would wander over to the film school, and they would have these public pushpin boards out on the outside of the building, where if you were directing one of your student films the following semester, you would like make one of those little flyers that has the little tearaway tabs at the bottom with your phone number, and it would say, I'm a junior level director shooting my 5-minute film, and I'm looking for cinematographers, so please call me. And so this person is actively advertising that their problem is cinematography. So I would call them and say, well, you're going to be in post eventually, so I'm assuming at some point you're going to need a composer. And now I'm not taking it literal.
That's a more constrained problem set. Right. That
I get it. I'm being a bit literal. There's a lot of caveats with that example, but point being, I was trying to think ahead.
That's being proactive, and I think that's great, and I think that's a really good example of something you can do starting out. Understanding that there's going to be this problem eventually, and you're there to provide the solution to that.
Yeah, boy, there's a lot of good stuff here. So I'm curious. Like, this shifts gears a little bit, but I think all of us probably have something to say about it, which is. I'll ask this one first, and then I'll get to the second one that I've got in mind here. But like, really basically, what are the fundamentals of creativity? What are the different domains of creativity? Most importantly, how do you get into your client/audience's mind, taking account the variables that have to be taken care of to maximize the experience for them? This is a pretty interesting question.
There's a lot of dimensions to that question.
Yeah,
It's a bit abstract. It's a bit abstract.
Let's start with where you think maybe the bounds of creativity. Is there anything that you feel like, I don't even know if that might be too abstract too. I was gonna.
Can I critique the question? Like I think
Go
actually
for
the
it.
best way for me to answer the question would be to critique the question. I think that at the end of the day, we're tradesmen. We're making something, right? And so if you can't break it down to a question that a carpenter might ask, then then maybe you're overthinking it, because the boundaries of creativity, I don't know, like creativity is the ability to create things, but what does somebody want? What does somebody need? And how do you provide that thing for them while bringing your own special brand of coolness to it? I guess I don't even know how to answer that question. That may be that you're overthinking. It may be that the person might be overthinking the problem a little bit.
So I had a conversation earlier with a new designer who's actually just coming on our team right now, and we were talking about sort of maybe this is a tangent. I'm not entirely sure, but like we were talking about the difference between being in a creative career as a professional versus being an amateur creator of some kind, right? And one of the big differences to me is that, like, to the tradesman point, in a lot of sense, as a professional, you can't afford to just be creative whenever the need strikes or whenever you feel like being creative. You can't take breaks.
You can't wait for the bolt of lightning. Yeah.
You can't wait for that bolt of lightning. You actually have deadlines that you've got to hit. If you're just a hobbyist, you get to, you can set down a project for 6 months or a year or 2 years or whatever and come back to it. And, you can Mr. Holland's opus it, and 30 years later, you've written literally one thing. Congratulations, right? But sorry, I have a little bit of bitterness to Mr. Holland's opus as a result. But look, I mean, you can't do that as a professional. So I guess, again, I don't know if this is a tangent or if this exactly sort of addresses the kind of the idea of the question or the spirit of it. But I think actually being able to command your creativity may be more important than defining the box of it in some ways.
I heard somebody put it this way recently. I heard somebody interviewed. Excuse me. And they said that, like, and I'll use the word genius loosely here. Let's call it the spark of inspiration that just comes out of nowhere.
Yeah.
That doesn't come very much. Usually it's you just sit there and you beat on the problem. And usually when that moment comes where you get inspiration, it's after you failed over and over again and you've made your brain prepared for that moment to come. You very rarely wake up in the morning with that stuff. It's usually you failed and failed and failed. And I think that you got to go to work, like you said. You can't sit around and Mr. Holland's opus it. You got to go to work every day. And you got to work on the problem, and you got to use your craft to try to solve the problem. There's a lot of things about craft, about game design, about music, about writing, that you could just bring certain tools that like, hey, what's the problem? What's the story? We have some basic questions we ask a ghost story or irrational. What story are we trying to tell? So whether that's, the actual story or an art asset or a character design, what story are you trying to tell? And quite often what you'll find is if the piece isn't working out, it's because we don't know the story we're trying to tell. Like we're just grasping at straws and saying, oh, let's make it look kind of like a stormtrooper meets Superman or whatever, right? But it doesn't tie into the real story we're trying to tell. Or what problem are you trying to solve is another question we ask a lot, which is, well, why are you working on this thing? Is there actually a problem in the game that this is going to solve? Or is it just something that's cool? Because does it fit into the overall rubric of the larger thing? And so there are these tradesman-like, craftsman-like questions, and understanding structure, understanding, whether that's story or music that you can start with. And that creative lightning bolt that hits you oh so rarely, man, that's just going to come when it comes. And it's only going to come after you've done the work.
Hold on, Austin. Before you jump in, I've got another question here that's tied into this that really just contextualizes a tiny bit, which is really something I've noticed about doing creative work is that when it's your job, sometimes you have to produce results when you're not feeling creative. So the question is, what do you do when you're feeling that way? So I just want to add that as a spin to your answer, because I'd love to get your specific take on how you barrel your way through some of those challenges.
I think it's my answer to that is very related to what I was going to say anyway. So good instinct to insert that, because for me, just creativity, part of why I've always been very passionate about science and just kind of the general human project of scientific inquiry. And part of the reason why is that I've often felt that it's very actually similar to creativity, because they're like, if you look at the setting aside all of the distractions from the point I'm trying to make about the history of the US's westward expansion. If you think of it, it's not a succession of like helicopter jumps where you're skipping over vast swaths of land. Like it was a frontier that moved, and it moved in fits and starts. And sometimes this part over here, gets pushed a lot farther, but then there's this huge gap down here. But the general progress is this very slow. You don't just teleport 100 miles past the frontier and start from this circle. And science works the exact same way, and creativity, I think, works the exact same way. Every innovation in music and every innovation in storytelling, is
every species of
this
plant.
line.
Every species of plant works that way. Like bacteria works that way. It's fractal. It just sort of expands where the opportunities are.
Exactly.
Sorry, go ahead, Austin. I just was getting excited about your science metaphor.
Yeah, well, I think it's applicable of all life. Like one of the things that always upsets, when you talk about sort of people that reject the theory of evolution and there's notion of, well, you're missing transitional species. And it's like, the only way to truly capture that would be to go all the way down to the individual of every organism that has ever lived. That would be the only way to eliminate truly everything transitional, because everything is iterative all the way down to the smallest level, and we're all just moving. And the more you zoom out, the slower that frontier is moving, the wider your view. But it's still, that's the case. And so I find the result is a very practical, like today, my job is to just move the boulder a millimeter. And that's exactly what Ken just said. That's no different than a carpenter saying, well, today I need to get up a bunch of drywall. Like, and it sounds in a way like all the romanticism of creativity is in reality something that's inherently unromantic or uninspired. But that's where I'm like, when I get in there and I'm propping my 2x4 up against the wall and I'm lining up my nails or whatever, my mind is going, I wonder if there's a more interesting, I wonder what's the optimal angle. And all the creativity is happening down in this small scale level where my fingertips are. And I'm excited and I'm thrilled. I mean, I always say there's no reason why accountants or whatever you think of as the most dry, uncreative lines of work, like I've had conversations where like my bookkeeper called me and said, I found a new way to arrange the spreadsheet that's going to auto calculate all these formulas, and it's so exciting. It's going to be so much better. And so even somebody that's doing theoretically the least creative work has found creative solutions to their problems. And I think that there's just no reason that can't happen in all domains of life. And so how do you bring that to work when you're not in the mood for it? Well, to me, if you're excited by it, then on some fundamental, yes, of course, someday we have terrible days. Like, I've taken the day off before because like a loved one died or whatever. Like life will insert itself. There's no question there. But generally speaking, if you have even the slightest excitement for what you're doing, that will encompass the range of moods. And hopefully it's a type of work, at least in my case, I'm lucky that the type of work encompasses a wide range of moods unto itself. Like sometimes I've tried to lean into that actually, but I think that it hopefully is something that can at least be abstractly applied to basically any line of work, if that made any sense.
No. So, gosh, there's just so many here that I want to get to, and so I'm going to just preemptively apologize, guys. There's no way we're going to get to a fraction of these at this point. And it's not for lack of trying. Like these are all really good questions, but it's going to take a lot longer than we actually have for this. I'm very excited about that, by the way. It's very cool. But so I like this one. It's got a dash of humor and sort of humility to it, if I can remember where the heck it is here. Sorry, I have so many now that I've lost track of things. Thoughts on networking and finding people to join your vision. It's hard to do, especially as a socially awkward autistic potato.
Well, the great thing about what I found, like, and it started when I used to play D&D as a socially awkward potato myself, is it gives you making things gives you a formalized structure to interact with people that is very different than going to a party and sitting there with a drink and having to just sort of meet people, because you already have a shared mission. And so I would view it as an opportunity for socially awkward people. And I think that's why a lot of socially awkward people, went to games. Like, I know when I finally got into games, I was, there were a lot of socially awkward people in games. There just are. It attracts them. And I think the reason it attracts them is it is a way for people to socialize with structure.
Yeah.
In the same way playing Dungeons and Dragons was a way to, when I was a kid, was a way to socialize with a structure. And it really helped me, and it made me more socialized, and therefore I could then maybe go to a party and understand how to interact with people, because I got to practice with this scaffolding of making something together.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would just add that to me, I've always defined networking as very purpose-driven human interaction of, like, I'm looking to meet you to see if there is a mutually beneficial exchange that we can discover. And for a freelancer, that's not really a good way to interact with people, because I'm not just looking for a transactional, I'm looking for a relationship. And I have found that my career blossomed 100-fold when I stopped worrying about what I was going to get from somebody and just focused on, is this someone that I would be friends with more broadly? And then as a result, I have people I'm friends with. Like, there are people I'm friends with who I've already known for years and years and years that are theoretically in a position to hire me, but probably never will, because they've got their needs met and we're just friends. And if I only ever had this networking mindset, I wouldn't have this valuable friendship in my life. And yet also, every opportunity I've ever had professionally has come from somebody who is equally my friend, who says, hey, I just pitched you for a project because I heard they were looking for a composer and you were the first person I thought. Well, I'm not going to be the first person that they think of if we're not genuinely in each other's lives and mattering, and the kinds of people that are going to want to have a meal together or go to each other's weddings or parties or that kind of thing. So, like, yeah, to me, networking, as at least I define it, is a thing that I actively discourage. It's just, don't forget to care about fellow human beings and recognize that over time, that will influence the trajectory of your career.
Yeah, I think that's
There's some very basic networking things I'd suggest is, like, don't write to somebody and ask them if they have jobs at your company, because the only thing I'm going to do is realize they haven't done the work of, like, make sure when you go to somebody that you've done all the work you could possibly do, and you're not asking them to do lifting that you could have done yourself. But I would stand by everything Austin said too, that networking as a concept might be overrated. Pure networking, handing out your business cards, LinkedIn, all that stuff. I don't think that a lot of people I've worked with have come from those kind of interactions. But I did get my start I met a playwright and I got to know him, and then he asked to read one of my plays, and I read my play and he liked it, and I said, how do I make money doing this? And he said, I'll introduce you to my agent. But it was an organic process.
You just said you got to know him. Yeah, exactly. What? Like, that wasn't networking at all.
Right. It was two writers talking for a while, right? And we got to know each other. And he read my play, and he asked to read the play, and he liked it. And it went from there. But it wasn't like I just came to him thinking, this guy's going to get me an agent. I had no idea. I just wanted to know him because he was a working playwright, and I was fascinated by that. And I was a young playwright. I just wanted to know him and understand his world.
I have two thoughts on this. One is networking in the hyper constructed way that we're talking about is something that terrifies me and I don't enjoy doing, and I've never enjoyed doing it. And fortunately, I found, just like you guys, that that's not where the success comes from anyway. I don't think I've ever gone to a conference or an event or something like that, handed out business cards, and then ended up with a meaningful client relationship as a result. But what I have done, and this I'll tell a very quick story. I became the creative producer for basically a producer for Fee in 2016. And the story of how I got there actually started 6 years earlier when I made a video on my own, and I sent it to a professor who had written a Fee article that it was actually kind of based on. The video that I had made was based on one of his articles. And I sent it to him, actually, before I even made it, I found his email address. Like, college professors is super easy. I mean, their information is super easy to find. And one thing that is a little piece of advice is people actually really like talking about themselves and their work. And I didn't ask him to help me with anything. I just told him, I said, I love this article that you made, and I'm planning on making it into a video. And he replied right away and said, hey, that's flattering and awesome, and I'm thrilled to hear that. Let me know when it comes out. Flash forward to a couple months later, I'd finished the video, I'd put it up on YouTube, I sent it to him, I sent the link, and I said, hey, told you I was going to make this, I made it, here it is. And he said, wow, this is so great, again, so flattering. Let me introduce you to Larry Reed, who was then the president of Fee. I then formed a relationship with him, formed a relationship with other people in the general network. But relationships. I wasn't going to Larry for a job. I did actually get some client work out of that over time, but it wasn't, that wasn't really the purpose. The purpose was, hey, here's this kid who made something that we like and that I think you would like, and
Yep.
check it out, right? And so that
Not to
built
mention that it exposed. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. Go ahead.
No, I was just that built the basis of a relationship that then 6 years later I would come back to and say, hey, I'm available to do this other thing for you guys now. And and that was purely because I had formed that relationship, and it wasn't it wasn't the product of a business card handout. So I think if you're daunted like I am, frankly, about the idea of going out and just, cold introducing yourself to a ton of people, you don't always have to do that. Obviously I did cold introduce myself to the professor that I talked to, but not from the standpoint of like, give me a job, but from the standpoint of, hey, I'm making something, you might be interested in it, take it or leave it. And then that built something better as a result.
Well, getting our ego stroked is part of most people have that problem that he solved, right? So you express an interest in his work, and that's not
I also think
sufficient.
that
but he.
What were you gonna say, Austin?
That's not sufficient with people usually who are really good at what they do. But it was an entree into him being interested in what you were doing because he was interested in himself.
Yeah.
And to the point we were making earlier, especially to my agent's advice that Ken took some issue with, you actually did precisely that thing, because Fee, at least as far as I'm aware, was not exactly a bustling YouTube channel looking for ways to explore subjects about property rights and individual liberty through pop culture. And you essentially created a position for yourself by saying, hey, these articles that you guys write, well, we could probably reach a totally different audience by exploring what does Wakanda say about trade, that to me, you actually did find, you essentially created, or you exposed a need that they didn't even know they had. And to me, I was totally, we've been friends forever. And yet despite years and years of sharing articles and things like that, I wasn't terribly familiar with Fee until you started making these out of frame videos and made a fan out of me. So and I was in prime position to already know. So to me, it's a perfect demonstration of what we're talking about.
Yeah. So, all right. So we're coming up on the end here. We got literally 3 minutes left. I want to do just final bits of just general advice. What would you tell somebody who wants to be in a creative career, like brass tacks? What's your best sort of one-liner to give people who want to be in this industry or in any of these kinds of industries?
I think, Ken, you should be the last word and be our grand finale. So I will just insert my one-liner that I've thought about over the years is, especially as a freelancer, the survival instinct is so strong that you anytime you're in a position to potentially get a job, all of your instincts will be telling you, just tell them what they want to hear in the hopes that they will hire you. And what I found is that overcoming that voice and learning to not be afraid to be divisive and to really speak my mind and to be okay with the idea that they might not like what I have to say, to the point that they may not hire me, that I'm actually setting up a better collaboration for those that like those. And I'm not saying be difficult, but just being divisive, or something that might even smell divisive, all your survival instincts will fly in the face of. But the more I just said, here's what I believe, and I'm not ashamed of that. You say you want orchestra. I think that's wrong. Here's why, and you're totally free to disagree, and let's talk about it. That took me a long time to have anything remotely resembling the confidence to do that, but I found that my career changed exponentially the more I felt that way, because people there are 50 million people who can do what I do from a craft standpoint. The only thing that makes me worth hiring is my specific viewpoint. So I have to be willing to assert that.
All right. So piggybacking on that a little bit, for me, what I will say is you are a craftsman at the end of the day. That perspective matters tremendously, and that uniqueness matters to everything that you do. But do not forget that the best way to get good at stuff is to make a lot of stuff. Make every possible thing you can and finish it. That's something I've noticed over the course of my experiences as a creative director, as working with other people for a long, long time. You need to actually finish. Even if it's bad, even if you don't like it at the end of it, finish it, make something else, and keep making things until you really develop that craft. I guess that's what I'll leave my advice. So Ken, final words from you, sir.
Your guys' wisdom has left me not too much room for maneuver here, because I think those are both excellent pieces of advice. I would say that a lot of people ask whether they should go into a creative field or not. I think the honest answer is, I think a lot of times people answer that question like, oh, it's so competitive and it's so this and it's so that, and the likelihood of you succeeding is blah, blah, blah. And I think that's a terrible answer, because the truth is the statistics don't matter. Like, individually, that's the way statistics don't work that way. The odds are so against you because you're either that guy or girl or you're not, and it's going to be what you do that's going to determine that. There's no way to determine that ahead of time statistically. So don't let that discourage you. But I will say that if you have to ask yourself the question, the answer is probably no. And it's got to be this itch. And I went through it. I failed as a screenwriter, originally. And I was out of the creative field for a while, but I was in so much misery by doing jobs that weren't creative that I eventually figured out a way back in by getting into games. And it's never a career I contemplated, even though I was a huge gamer, but I was suffering not being able to do this. And I took a massive, it wasn't easy on my life. I moved, I took a fraction of the money I was making. I was, I'm working on Wall Street as a IT guy, making real money. They offered me a partnership to stay, and it wasn't even a question for me. So I went to Looking Glass and I took this job, which paid not very much. And, it was probably, underpaid at that time, and it's gotten better since then. I think the field's gotten a lot better, but it is hard. And it's a really simple answer. Do you have a choice? And if you have a choice, probably do something else. But if you don't have a choice, don't let the numbers scare you, because there's a winnowing factor right away of people who are in there who feel they have a choice, and those people are not probably going to make it. It's those like you who feel they don't have a choice who are probably going to have a much better chance already of rising and succeeding.
Yeah. That I like ending that way. I think this was great. For everybody whose questions we missed, I'm so sorry. Like this was kind of overwhelming with the number of questions, and I can't thank you all for tuning in and watching and sticking around this long. So thank you guys all for joining this webinar. Thank you, Austin. Thank you, Ken, for joining me today. This has been really a fascinating and for me, a really wonderful conversation. So thank you guys very, very much.
Thank you.
All right. That concludes our Day 2 Entrepreneur Week webinar. We're going to kind of close this out with a little short video, I think, and then I think there's some information on how to get into the free iPad giveaway that we're doing. So check that out, and then be sure to check out Day 3. We've got a great session tomorrow. So be sure to tune in to Day 3 of Entrepreneur Week, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks for attending our session on how to build your career on creativity. We hope you're ready to put your creative talents into professional use. As a reminder, by attending this session, you have a chance to win a free iPad. Make sure to review the details in the post-program email. Subscribe to Out of Frame on YouTube for more big ideas on art, pop culture, and media. Join us tomorrow for our final event on how to attain financial freedom. FEE's Director of Entrepreneurial Education, TK Coleman, will host a panel featuring Leo Jean-Louis, founder of Freedom is a Choice movement, and Kezia Williams, CEO of The Black Upstart, for a discussion on how mastering your finances will make you more free. See you then!